The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before Christmas. I was sitting in my cramped studio apartment, grading papers by lamplight because the overhead bulb had burned out again and I couldn't afford to replace it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My phone buzzed against the stack of history exams, and I almost didn't answer. The number was blocked, which usually meant telemarketers or debt collectors. But something made me swipe across the screen. Sarah Mitchell? The voice was crisp, professional, with an authority that made me sit straighter in my secondhand chair. This is she, I replied, already bracing myself for whatever bill I couldn't pay or mistake I'd apparently made. Ms. Mitchell, this is Colonel Patricia Hayes from the Department of Defense. I'm calling regarding your security clearance application and your dissertation on Middle Eastern geopolitical strategy. We need to discuss an immediate opportunity. The papers slipped from my lap onto the floor. The Pentagon. The actual Pentagon was calling my phone, the same phone that my mother had refused to answer for 6 months, the same number my siblings had blocked after calling me the family disappointment one too many times. 6 months earlier, Christmas morning had shattered what was left of my relationship with my family. I remember standing in the kitchen of my childhood home in suburban Ohio, still wearing my pajamas at noon because I'd driven 12 hours straight from my graduate program at Georgetown just to be there. The smell of cinnamon rolls and coffee should have felt like comfort, but instead it felt like a trap I'd walked into willingly. My mother, Linda, was arranging presents under the tree with the precision of a military operation, each gift perfectly wrapped in coordinating paper. My older brother Jake sat in Dad's old recliner, scrolling through his phone while his wife Rebecca chased their twin boys around the living room. My younger sister Amanda was curled up on the couch, fresh from her recent engagement, showing off her ring to anyone who would look. I was the odd one out, as usual. 28 years old, unmarried, buried in debt from my PhD program, and apparently the source of endless family shame. I'd always been different. While Jake played football, and Amanda was homecoming queen, I spent my weekends at the library, reading about international relations and dreaming of making a difference in the world. My parents tolerated it when I was younger, but as I got older, their patience wore thin. Sarah's still playing school, I heard my mother whisper to my aunt in the kitchen, the words cutting deeper than any blade. At her age, I had 3 children and a mortgage. She's just avoiding real life. The conversation I'd been dreading started during present opening. Jake got tools for his contracting business, Amanda received jewelry and wedding planning books, and the twins were buried under expensive toys. When it came to me, Mom handed over a small package with the enthusiasm of someone disposing of garbage. Inside was a gift card to Target and a self-help book titled, Finding Your Purpose After 30. The title alone felt like a slap, but it was Amanda's snicker that pushed me over the edge. "What's so funny?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Nothing," Amanda said, still grinning. "It's just nice that Mom found something appropriate for once." Appropriate? My mother sighed deeply, the sound she'd perfected to show her disappointment in me. "Sarah, honey, we're just concerned. You're almost 30, you have no real job, no husband, no children. You're still playing dress-up as a student while the rest of us have actual responsibilities." The room went quiet except for the twins' chatter. Even they seemed to sense the tension. I felt every eye on me, waiting for my response, probably expecting me to apologize for existing the way I always did. "I'm working on my PhD in international relations," I said quietly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I'm specializing in Middle Eastern policy and conflict resolution. It's not playing dress-up. Jake looked up from his phone for the first time all morning. "Come on, Sarah. When are you going to join the real world? You can't hide in school forever." "I'm not hiding. I'm working towards something meaningful." "Meaningful?" Rebecca joined in, bouncing one of the twins on her hip. "What's meaningful about racking up debt and living like a college freshman? At least Jake provides for his family." The words came like arrows, each one finding its mark. I'd heard variations of this conversation for years, but never all at once. never with such coordinated cruelty. It felt orchestrated, like they discussed my failures over coffee before I'd even arrived. "Your father would be so disappointed," Mom said, and that was the killing blow. Dad had died 3 years ago, and she knew exactly how to use his memory as a weapon. He always hoped you'd settle down, give him grandchildren. Instead, you're throwing your life away on some fantasy career that will never happen. The room spun slightly. I gripped the arm of the couch, trying to steady myself against the assault. Dad supported my education. He was proud of me. "He was worried about you," Mom corrected. "We all are. You're the family disgrace, Sarah. 30 years old with nothing to show for it but student loans and delusions. Family disgrace." The words echoed in my head like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Amanda nodded along with Mom's assessment. Jake had already returned to his phone, as if my humiliation was too boring to hold his attention. Rebecca was making sympathetic faces, but I could see the judgment in her eyes. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady. The gift card and book fell to the floor, and I didn't bother picking them up. "I should go." "Sarah, don't be dramatic," Mom called after me, but she made no move to stop me. "We're just being honest. Someone has to tell you the truth." I walked upstairs to gather my things, my childhood bedroom now converted into Mom's craft room, my presence erased as thoroughly as if I'd never existed. 20 minutes later, I was back in my car, driving through the snow toward D.C., my eyes too blurry with tears to see the road clearly. The worst part wasn't the words themselves. It was the realization that they'd been thinking these things all along, storing up their disappointment and resentment until they could unleash it all at once. I was the family disgrace, the cautionary tale they'd probably tell at future gatherings. Remember Sarah? She wasted her life chasing dreams instead of growing up. I made it back to my apartment that night and didn't leave for 3 days. I ordered pizza and Chinese food, ignored my advisor's emails about my dissertation defense, and seriously considered dropping out of everything. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just avoiding real life, hiding behind academic achievements that meant nothing to anyone but me. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from college friends sharing Christmas photos, their lives looking perfect and purposeful, while I felt like I was dissolving into nothing. I didn't answer any calls. I didn't check social media. I just existed in the smallest possible space, wondering if this was what rock bottom felt like. The months that followed were a blur of survival. I threw myself into my dissertation with desperate intensity, working 18-hour days in the library because going home to my empty apartment meant facing the silence my family had left behind. Not one of them called to check on me after Christmas. Not one apology or attempt to bridge the gap they'd torn open. I survived on ramen noodles and coffee, lost 15 pounds I couldn't afford to lose, and developed insomnia that left me staring at the ceiling every night, replaying their words. Family disgrace. The phrase became a soundtrack to my days, a reminder of everything I wasn't and might never be. My dissertation advisor, Professor Chen, started expressing concern about my health and my increasingly obsessive work habits. "Sarah, when's the last time you took a day off? You look exhausted." "I'm fine," I'd insist, though we both knew it was a lie. Fine people don't live on 4 hours of sleep and exist solely on vending machine snacks. Fine people have families who call them, who care about their well-being, who don't reduce their entire existence to a punchline at Christmas dinner. I defended my dissertation in May, 8 months after that devastating Christmas morning. My research on Middle Eastern conflict resolution and policy had consumed my life so completely that I could recite entire sections from memory. The defense went well, better than well. The committee was impressed by my analysis of recent developments in Syria and Afghanistan, my understanding of diplomatic nuances, and my innovative approaches to long-standing problems. But when it was over, when I'd officially earned my PhD and should have been celebrating, I sat alone in my apartment with takeout Chinese food and wondered what came next. I'd achieved what I'd worked toward for 6 years, and there was no one to tell. My family hadn't even known the date of my defense, much less attended or congratulated me. The job market for international relations PhDs was brutal. I applied for dozens of positions at universities, think tanks, and government agencies, receiving mostly form rejection letters or silence. The few interviews I managed to secure went nowhere. Too academic for practical positions, too inexperienced for senior roles. I was trapped in the space between student and professional, belonging nowhere. By October, I was substitute teaching at a local high school to pay rent. My advanced degree reduced to babysitting teenagers who had no interest in world history. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family had accused me of avoiding the real world, and now the real world was avoiding me. Maybe they'd been right all along. Maybe I really was just playing dress-up, pretending to be someone important, while living paycheck to paycheck like any other 20-something who'd made poor life choices. The security clearance application had been a desperate last resort. I'd applied for several government positions months earlier, most of which required extensive background checks and clearances I wasn't sure I'd qualify for. My credit wasn't perfect. I had no family references who would speak positively about me. And my social media presence was minimal to the point of being suspicious. I'd submitted the paperwork with little hope, expecting it to disappear into the same bureaucratic void that had swallowed my other applications. When the FBI agents showed up at my apartment building in September to interview my neighbors, I figured it was routine processing that would ultimately lead nowhere. When they called my former professors and college roommates, I prepared myself for another rejection letter. The process moved slowly. Background investigations always did, and I tried not to think about it too much, which made that phone call from Colonel Hayes feel like a miracle or a mistake. Probably a mistake. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm going to be direct with you," the colonel's voice continued through my stunned silence. "Your research on Middle Eastern policy has caught significant attention within the Department of Defense. Your analysis of recent developments in Afghanistan and Syria, particularly your insights into regional power dynamics and diplomatic solutions, is exactly what we need for a developing situation." I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I intended. "I'm sorry, what situation?" "I can't discuss specifics over an unsecured line, but I can tell you that we have an immediate need for someone with your expertise. Your security clearance came through faster than expected, and your background investigation raised some impressive red flags. Good red flags. You speak Arabic and Farsi, correct?" "Yes, ma'am. I studied both languages as part of my graduate program." The words felt surreal leaving my mouth. 6 months ago, my mother had called my language studies a waste of time. Now the Pentagon was asking about them. Outstanding. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm going to ask you to do something that might sound unusual. I need you to be at Ronald Reagan Airport tomorrow morning at 0800 hours. Terminal B, Delta check-in counter. Someone will be there to meet you with a boarding pass and further instructions." My head spun. Tomorrow morning? I have classes to teach. I can't just... "Ms. Mitchell, let me be clear. This is not a request you want to decline. This opportunity will not come again. And frankly, we don't have time to wait. Are you available tomorrow morning or not?" I looked around my apartment, at the stack of ungraded papers, at the empty refrigerator, at the life I'd built from scraps and stubbornness. What did I have to lose? What was I protecting by staying? "Yes, ma'am, I'll be there." Excellent. "And Ms. Mitchell? Don't discuss this conversation with anyone. Not family, not friends, not colleagues. This is classified from this moment forward." The line went dead, leaving me sitting in the dark with my mouth open and my world turned completely upside down. The Pentagon had called my direct line. They knew my work, valued my expertise, needed my help. The family Disgrace had just been recruited by the most powerful military organization in the world. I spent the rest of the night pacing my apartment, alternating between excitement and terror. This could be the break I'd dreamed of, the validation I'd craved, the proof that my years of study and sacrifice had meant something. Or it could be an elaborate mistake that would leave me even more humiliated than before. But as I packed a small bag and prepared for whatever tomorrow would bring, one thought kept echoing in my mind. In 8 hours, I'd be walking through an airport toward an opportunity my family couldn't even imagine. The daughter they'd written off as a failure was about to step into a world where her knowledge mattered, where her skills were valued, where she wasn't a disgrace but an asset. For the first time since Christmas morning, I smiled. The flight to Washington was a blur of classified briefings and documents, I wasn't allowed to read until we landed. The man who met me at the airport introduced himself only as Agent Morrison, handed me a boarding pass to a destination he wouldn't name, and spent the 3-hour flight watching me sign non-disclosure agreements that made my head spin. When we finally landed at what I later learned was Joint Base Andrews, I felt like I'd stepped into a different universe entirely. The Pentagon itself was more overwhelming than I'd imagined. Miles of corridors, thousands of people moving with purpose I couldn't fathom, and a sense of controlled urgency that made my academic world feel like a children's playground. Colonel Hayes was everything her voice had suggested. Tall, sharp, with eyes that seemed to catalog information faster than most people could process it. She led me through security checkpoints that required scans I'd never seen before, and into a conference room that felt like the Situation Room from every political thriller I'd ever watched. "Ms. Mitchell, welcome to the heart of American defense policy," she said, gesturing to a chair at a table surrounded by screens and maps I couldn't begin to interpret. "What I'm about to share with you is classified at the highest levels. Your background check cleared you for this briefing, but I need to emphasize that everything you see and hear in this room is compartmentalized information that cannot leave this building." The next 4 hours changed everything I thought I knew about my field of study. The situation they needed help with was complex beyond anything I'd encountered in academic settings. Regional conflicts in the Middle East had escalated in ways that weren't being reported in public. Diplomatic channels were breaking down faster than they could be repaired, and traditional policy approaches weren't working. They needed fresh perspectives, innovative solutions, and someone who understood the cultural and linguistic nuances that their usual analysts were missing. "Your dissertation identified patterns that our intelligence community overlooked," Colonel Hayes explained, pulling up slides that showed my research integrated with classified intelligence reports. "Your analysis of regional power structures and your proposed diplomatic frameworks align with developments we're seeing in real time. We need you to expand on this work, but instead of theoretical applications, we need practical solutions that can be implemented immediately." The work was intoxicating. For the first time in my life, my knowledge felt powerful, necessary, urgent. The theoretical frameworks I'd spent years developing weren't just academic exercises anymore. They were tools that could influence actual policy, shape real diplomatic efforts, potentially save lives. The other analysts in the room listened when I spoke, took notes on my observations, asked questions that demonstrated they valued my expertise. I was assigned temporary quarters on base and given a security badge that granted access to areas most people would never see. The workdays were long, often 16 hours of intense analysis and briefings, but I thrived on the pressure. Every morning brought new intelligence reports that needed interpretation, policy recommendations that required my input, briefings where my voice carried actual weight. The contrast with my previous life was stunning. 6 months earlier, I'd been ignored in my own family's living room, dismissed as irrelevant and immature. Now I was sitting in meetings where generals asked for my opinions, where my recommendations were being forwarded to the Secretary of Defense, where my analysis was informing decisions that would affect international relations for years to come. But the isolation was complete. The classification levels meant I couldn't discuss my work with anyone outside the building. My old life became a memory I visited only during brief moments between briefings. I couldn't tell my former colleagues where I was or what I was doing. I couldn't update my social media or respond to the few friends who still tried to reach out. I existed in a bubble of secrecy that felt both thrilling and suffocating. 3 weeks into my assignment, I was given my own office with a view of the Potomac River and a title that made me dizzy: Senior Policy Analyst, Middle Eastern Affairs. The nameplate on my door felt like vindication carved in brass. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the same woman my family had called a disgrace, now had her name on a door in the Pentagon. The same education they'd mocked was now classified as a national security asset. The first time I used my new security clearance to access intelligence databases, I felt like I'd been given the keys to the world's most important library. Information that shaped global politics was at my fingertips. Diplomatic cables, intelligence assessments, policy briefings that would make front-page news if they were ever leaked. I was trusted with secrets that could topple governments, and the responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying. My analysis began influencing actual policy within a month. A diplomatic initiative I'd proposed was implemented in Syria, leading to a ceasefire that held for longer than anyone had expected. A framework I'd developed for understanding regional tribal dynamics helped prevent a conflict in Afghanistan that could have destabilized the entire region. For the first time in my life, I could see the direct impact of my work, and it was significant. The financial transformation was equally dramatic. My government salary was more than I'd ever imagined earning, with benefits that included housing allowances, security clearance bonuses, and healthcare that actually covered my needs. I moved from my cramped studio apartment to a townhouse in Alexandria, furnished it with actual furniture instead of secondhand finds, and bought clothes that fit properly. The constant financial stress that had defined my adult life simply disappeared. But the emotional isolation deepened. The security requirements meant I couldn't maintain normal relationships. Dates required background checks. Friendships needed security approvals. Every aspect of my personal life became subject to review and classification. I was successful beyond my wildest dreams and lonelier than I'd ever been, surrounded by colleagues who respected my work but couldn't be trusted with personal confidences. The holidays approached with a symmetry that felt like cosmic justice. Thanksgiving came and went, without acknowledgement from my family, the same silence they'd maintained since Christmas. But this year, instead of sitting alone in an empty apartment, I spent the day in briefings that dealt with international crises. Instead of grading papers for students who didn't care, I was analyzing intelligence reports that could prevent wars. December brought assignment notifications that made my head spin. I was being considered for permanent positions that would require relocation to embassies overseas, analyst roles that would put me at the center of international negotiations, policy positions that would make me one of the youngest senior advisors in the Department of Defense. The same month my family had called me a disgrace, I was being recruited for roles that would place me at the highest levels of American foreign policy. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family had spent the year assuming I was still struggling as a substitute teacher, I'd become someone whose analysis was briefed to cabinet-level officials. While they'd been sharing photos of their normal, respectable lives on social media, I'd been living a life so classified I couldn't even acknowledge it existed. The daughter they'd written off had become someone they couldn't even conceptualize. But the silence from home began to eat at me in unexpected ways. Success felt hollow when there was no one to share it with, when the people who were supposed to celebrate my achievements had no idea they were happening. I wanted to call my mother and tell her that her disappointment in my career had been spectacularly misplaced. I wanted to show Jake that my education hadn't been a waste of time but had led to opportunities he couldn't imagine. I wanted Amanda to know that while she was planning her wedding, I was helping plan international policy. The security protocols made revenge impossible. I couldn't post photos of my Pentagon badge or share stories of my briefings. I couldn't casually mention my salary or my title or the fact that generals knew my name. My success had to remain as invisible as my previous failures had been visible. The vindication I craved was locked behind classification levels that made it meaningless to the people I most wanted to impress. Christmas approached like an anniversary of my humiliation, but this year I wouldn't be going home to Ohio. I'd be spending the holidays on base, managing a crisis that required round-the-clock analysis. The same family gathering where I'd been called a disgrace would happen without me, and they'd probably assume I was too embarrassed to show my face again. They had no way of knowing that I wasn't coming home because I was too important to leave. The weight of that secrecy began to feel crushing. I'd achieved everything I'd dreamed of, proven every doubter wrong, exceeded every expectation, and I couldn't tell anyone. The success that should have felt like triumph felt like another form of isolation. I was winning a game no one knew I was playing, which made the victory feel abstract and unsatisfying. But late at night, when I'd review intelligence reports in my secure office overlooking the river, I'd remember Christmas morning. I'd remember the casual cruelty in their voices, the certainty with which they'd dismissed my potential, the way they'd written me off as fundamentally defective. And I'd know that regardless of whether they ever learned the truth, I'd proven them wrong in ways they couldn't even imagine. The family disgrace had become a national security asset. The daughter who was avoiding real life was now helping shape global reality. The woman they'd pitied was now someone whose opinions mattered to the most powerful government in the world. Whether they knew it or not, I'd won. Yet the hollow feeling persisted. Victory without witnesses felt like applause in an empty theater. I'd spent my life craving their approval. And now that I'd achieved something worthy of it, their approval had become meaningless. But their dismissal still stung, even as I sat in meetings that would determine international policy for decades to come. The phone on my desk remained silent of personal calls. My family didn't know where I worked or what I did with my days. For all they knew, I was still struggling as a substitute teacher, still the cautionary tale they'd made me into at Christmas dinner. The gap between their perception and my reality had become so vast it felt like living in parallel universes. And as December deepened toward another Christmas, I began to wonder if that gap would ever close, if vindication required witnesses, and whether success that couldn't be shared was really success at all. The answer would come sooner than I expected, but not in any way I could have anticipated. My classified world was about to collide with my family's assumptions, in a way that would shatter both forever. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in mid-December, when intelligence reports started flooding in about a developing situation in the Persian Gulf that could destabilize the entire region. I was in my office reviewing diplomatic cables when Colonel Hayes burst through my door with an urgency I'd never seen from her before. Her usual composed demeanor had cracked, revealing the kind of stress that comes with decisions that could affect millions of lives. "Mitchell, we need you in the Situation Room immediately," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "The Secretary of Defense is flying in from Brussels, and he's specifically requested your analysis on this developing crisis." The Situation Room was chaos controlled by protocol. Screens displayed satellite imagery from 3 different time zones, secure phones rang constantly with updates from field operatives, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. I'd been in high-pressure briefings before, but this felt different. This felt like the kind of moment that would be studied in history books decades from now. Secretary Williams was exactly what I'd expected from his reputation: imposing, sharp, and possessing the kind of authority that made even senior generals straighten their posture when he entered a room. What I hadn't expected was for him to know my name before introductions were made. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, extending a hand that felt like shaking hands with policy itself. "I've been reading your analysis for months. Your work on regional power dynamics has been invaluable to our understanding of this crisis. I need you to walk me through your assessment of what we're dealing with here." The next 6 hours were the most intense of my professional life. The crisis involved multiple actors across several countries, with diplomatic implications that stretched far beyond the immediate region. Traditional policy approaches weren't working, because the situation was evolving faster than bureaucratic responses could adapt. They needed real-time analysis, creative solutions, and someone who could think beyond conventional diplomatic frameworks. My recommendations were implemented within hours of being presented. Diplomatic initiatives I'd designed were being executed by ambassadors in 3 different countries simultaneously. Intelligence assets were being repositioned based on my analysis of regional tribal loyalties. Military resources were being allocated according to strategic assessments I'd developed in my supposedly useless academic research. But the most significant moment came when Secretary Williams pulled me aside during a brief recess in our marathon briefing session. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm going to be direct with you. This crisis is going to require sustained, high-level attention for the next several months. I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Middle Eastern Affairs. The position comes with a direct line to my office and responsibility for coordinating our entire regional policy response." I felt the world tilt slightly. Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary was a position typically held by career diplomats with decades of experience. I was 30 years old with less than 6 months of government service. The promotion would make me one of the youngest senior officials in the Department of Defense, with authority over policies that affected millions of people across multiple countries. "Sir, I'm honored, but I've only been here 6 months," I managed to say, still processing the magnitude of what he was offering. "Dr. Mitchell, in 6 months you've produced more actionable intelligence analysis than some of our senior staff have generated in years. This crisis requires someone who can think creatively, adapt quickly, and understand nuances that traditional analysts miss. Your background makes you uniquely qualified for this role." The promotion was approved within 48 hours, fast-tracked through channels that normally took months to navigate. By Friday afternoon I had a new title, a new office on the 4th floor with windows overlooking the Memorial Bridge, and a staff of 12 analysts reporting directly to me. The nameplate on my door now read, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Middle Eastern Affairs, and seeing it still made me dizzy. The new position came with responsibilities that felt surreal. I was now briefing senior officials daily, my analysis was being included in the President's daily intelligence briefing, and my recommendations were influencing policy decisions at the highest levels of government. The same brain that my family had dismissed as unfocused and impractical was now trusted with some of the most sensitive intelligence in the American government. But the isolation deepened exponentially. The higher my security clearance rose, the smaller my world became. I couldn't discuss my work with anyone outside a very small circle of similarly cleared individuals. My social life became non-existent, as potential relationships required extensive background investigations that scared away anyone not already working in classified environments. I was successful beyond measure and lonelier than I'd ever imagined possible. The financial benefits were equally dramatic. My new salary was more than my entire family's household income combined, with bonuses tied to successful policy implementations that had already started paying out. I moved from my townhouse in Alexandria to a penthouse apartment in Georgetown, furnished it with pieces that cost more than I used to make in a year, and still saved more money each month than I'd previously earned. December wore on with 12-hour days that blended into 16-hour marathons as the crisis demanded constant attention. I was living on 4 hours of sleep, surviving on classified briefings and coffee, but thriving in a way I'd never experienced. Every day brought new challenges that required the exact expertise I'd spent years developing, problems that couldn't be solved without the knowledge my family had mocked as impractical. 3 weeks into my new role, the breakthrough came. A diplomatic initiative I'd designed succeeded in preventing what intelligence assessments had predicted would be a regional war. The ceasefire I'd helped negotiate held past critical deadlines, and intelligence reports suggested that my analysis had correctly identified the key pressure points that made resolution possible. The success was classified at levels that meant it would never be publicly acknowledged, but within the building it established my reputation as someone who delivered results under pressure. Secretary Williams called me to his office the morning after the ceasefire was signed. His corner office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who controlled the most powerful military in human history. Imposing, sophisticated, and filled with photographs of handshakes with world leaders whose names appeared in history textbooks. Dr. Mitchell, what you accomplished this week will prevent a conflict that could have destabilized the entire region for decades, he said, pouring coffee from a service that probably cost more than most people's cars. I'm recommending you for the Secretary of Defense Medal for Exceptional Public Service. It's the highest civilian honor we can bestow, and you've earned it. The medal ceremony was scheduled for the week between Christmas and New Year's, a timing that felt loaded with irony. The same period when my family would be celebrating their normal, respectable lives would be when I received recognition from the Secretary of Defense for exceptional service to national security. The contrast felt like something a screenwriter would have rejected as too heavy-handed. But the medal, significant as it was, paled in comparison to what Secretary Williams told me next. Dr. Mitchell, I've been in discussions with the National Security Council about your future. There's a position opening up in the spring that would place you at the White House, working directly with the President's senior advisors on Middle Eastern policy. The role would make you one of the youngest National Security Council members in history. The White House. The National Security Council. Direct access to the President of the United States. The progression from substitute teacher to presidential advisor in less than a year felt like something that happened to other people, not to the family disgrace from suburban Ohio who couldn't even get her relatives to return her phone calls. As December moved toward Christmas, the symmetry became impossible to ignore. 1 year ago, I'd been sitting in my mother's living room being told I was a disappointment to the family, a cautionary tale about wasted potential and poor life choices. Now I was being considered for positions that would place me at the center of American power, trusted with decisions that affected global stability. The security protocols meant I couldn't share any of this with the people who had hurt me most. I couldn't post photos of my Pentagon office, or mention my security clearance, or casually drop references to briefing cabinet officials. My success had to remain as invisible to them as my previous failures had been public. The vindication I craved was locked behind classification levels that made it meaningless to anyone outside the government. But late at night, when I'd review intelligence reports in my secure office, I'd think about Christmas morning. I'd remember the casual certainty with which they'd dismissed my potential, the way they'd written me off as fundamentally flawed, the complete absence of faith in my ability to contribute anything meaningful to the world. And I'd know that regardless of whether they ever learned the truth, every assumption they'd made about me had been spectacularly wrong. The family disgrace was now briefing the Secretary of Defense. The daughter who was avoiding real life was now helping shape American foreign policy. The woman they'd pitied was now someone whose decisions affected international relations. Whether they knew it or not, their assessment of my worth had been off by several orders of magnitude. Then, 2 days before Christmas, everything changed. I was in my office late on a Thursday evening, reviewing intelligence reports for Friday's briefing, when my secure phone rang with a call that would shatter the carefully maintained separation between my two worlds. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Agent Stevens from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. We have a situation that requires your immediate attention. There's been a security breach involving your personal information, and we need to discuss protective measures for you and your family." The word family hit me like cold water. My family? What kind of security breach? "Ma'am, someone has been making inquiries about your background and current position. The inquiries appear to be coming from individuals who have personal connections to you. We need to discuss this in person, but I can tell you that your family members may be at risk due to your classified position." My stomach dropped. The two worlds I'd kept carefully separated were about to collide in ways that could destroy both. My family, who had no idea what I actually did for a living, was about to be thrust into a security situation they couldn't understand. And my carefully constructed professional life was about to be exposed to people who had already proven they couldn't be trusted with my personal vulnerabilities. The call that would follow, the one that would force me to choose between protecting my family and protecting my secrets, was still hours away. But as I sat in my Pentagon office, surrounded by classified materials and metals I couldn't display, I realized that the collision between my two worlds might finally provide the vindication I'd been craving. Or it might destroy everything I'd built in the process. The security breach meant that my family was about to learn exactly what their family disgrace had become. Whether that revelation would bring satisfaction or catastrophe remained to be seen. But after a year of invisible success, I was about to find out what happened when the people who had written me off discovered they'd made the biggest mistake of their lives. Agent Stevens arrived at my office within an hour, accompanied by 2 other agents whose presence filled my Pentagon workspace with intention I'd never experienced before. The FBI's involvement in my personal life felt like crossing a line I hadn't known existed, transforming my family from distant disappointments into potential security liabilities. Stevens was everything you'd expect from a counterintelligence operative. Precise, careful, and possessing the kind of intensity that made every word feel loaded with implications I couldn't fully grasp. "Dr. Mitchell, what I'm about to tell you is classified, but it directly affects your family's safety," he began, setting a thick folder on my desk that bore markings I'd learned to associate with highly sensitive materials. "Over the past week, we've detected unusual inquiries about your background and current position. These inquiries are originating from someone with intimate knowledge of your personal history, someone who knows details about your life that aren't publicly available." The room seemed to shrink around me as he opened the folder, revealing surveillance photos that made my blood run cold. Pictures of my mother's house in Ohio, my brother Jake's construction company, Amanda's apartment near the university where she was finishing her master's degree. The FBI had been watching my family, documenting their daily routines, analyzing their potential vulnerabilities. The people who had dismissed me as irrelevant had become subjects of federal surveillance because of my importance. "The inquiries appear to be coming from someone within your family circle," Stevens continued, his voice carefully neutral in a way that suggested he was delivering information that would be difficult to process. "Someone has been asking questions about your current employment, your security clearance, your salary and benefits. They've been persistent enough to trigger our monitoring systems." I stared at the photos spread across my desk, trying to process the magnitude of what he was telling me. Someone in my family was actively investigating my life, probably trying to verify whether I was still the failure they'd written me off as. The irony was staggering. While I'd been respecting their privacy by maintaining complete silence about my work, one of them had been violating mine by digging into information they had no right to access. Who? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. We believe it's your brother, Jake Mitchell. He's been making calls to Georgetown University, trying to verify your educational credentials. He's contacted the high school where you used to substitute teach, asking about your departure. Most significantly, he's been asking neighbors in your old apartment building about government agents conducting background interviews last year. Jake. Of course it was Jake. My older brother, who had always seen me as competition for parental attention, who had been the most vocal about my supposed failures at Christmas dinner. He couldn't let it go, couldn't accept that maybe their assessment of my life had been wrong. He had to keep picking at the wound, trying to prove that I was still the disappointment they'd made me into. Dr. Mitchell, there's more, Stevens said, pulling out additional documents that made my stomach clench. These inquiries have attracted attention from foreign intelligence services. Your position makes you a high-value target, and any unusual interest in your background triggers automatic monitoring protocols. Your brother's investigation has inadvertently exposed your family to surveillance from hostile entities. The weight of his words settled over me like lead. My family's cruel dismissal of my achievements had now put them in actual danger. Their need to verify my continued failure had made them targets of foreign intelligence operations. The same people who had called me a disgrace were now at risk because I had become too important for their amateur investigation to go unnoticed. What kind of danger are we talking about? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Kidnapping, leverage operations, blackmail attempts against you through threats to them. Stevens replied with the clinical detachment of someone who dealt with these possibilities every day. Your position gives you access to intelligence that multiple foreign governments would pay extraordinary amounts to obtain. Your family members have now been identified as potential pressure points. The room spun slightly as I processed the full implications. My success had made my family vulnerable to threats they couldn't even comprehend. The same relatives who had dismissed my career as meaningless were now potential targets for international kidnapping operations because my career had become too meaningful to ignore. We need to implement protective measures immediately, Stevens continued, spreading out tactical assessments that looked like something from a spy thriller. This means relocating your family members to secure locations, providing them with protective details, and most importantly, briefing them on the situation that your position has created. My heart stopped. Briefing them? You mean telling them what I actually do? Dr. Mitchell, we can't protect people who don't understand why they need protection. Your family will need to be informed about your role in the Department of Defense, your security clearance level, and the specific threats that your position has generated. This briefing will require security clearances for all of them, which means extensive background investigations into their finances, associations, and personal histories. The cosmic justice of it was overwhelming. My family, who had spent a year believing I was still struggling as a substitute teacher, was about to receive federal security clearances because my classified work had made them valuable targets. The relatives who had called me the family disgrace were about to learn that I was important enough to attract foreign intelligence operations. When does this briefing happen? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. We're flying your family to Washington tomorrow morning. They'll be told it's a security matter involving someone they know, but they won't be given specifics until they're in a secure facility. The briefing will take place at a classified location in Northern Virginia, and you'll be present to provide context about your work and answer their questions. Tomorrow morning. Less than 24 hours from now, I would be sitting across from my mother, Jake, and Amanda in a government facility, watching their faces as they learned that everything they thought they knew about my life had been wrong. The daughter they had written off would be revealed as someone so important that foreign governments considered her family worth targeting. Stevens and his team spent the next 2 hours walking me through protocols I'd never imagined needing. Security procedures for family members. Communication restrictions that would govern all future contact with my relatives. And contingency plans for various threat scenarios that sounded like plots from action movies. My personal life was being militarized, transformed from private disappointment into classified operation. The Hardest part was maintaining my normal facade while my world reorganized itself around this revelation. I finished my day of briefings, attended the evening intelligence update, and reviewed policy documents as if my family wasn't being swept into protective custody at that very moment. The compartmentalization that had served me well in keeping my work secret now felt like a psychological survival mechanism. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my Georgetown apartment, staring at the ceiling and imagining the conversation that awaited me in less than 12 hours. How do you explain to people who have spent a year assuming you're a failure that you've actually become one of the most important policy analysts in the American government? How do you tell your family that their casual cruelty has been replaced by federal protection because you've become too valuable to leave unguarded? The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp December clarity that made Washington look like a postcard. I drove to the secure facility in Northern Virginia through streets that looked deceptively normal, knowing that by the time I returned home that evening, my relationship with my family would be permanently transformed. The building itself was nondescript, the kind of government facility that blended into suburban landscaping in a way that suggested it was designed to be forgotten. Stevens met me at the entrance, his expression more serious than I'd seen before. "Dr. Mitchell, your family arrived an hour ago. They've been told they're here for a security briefing related to someone they know, but they haven't been given any specifics. They're confused, concerned, and, frankly, a little frightened. Are you ready for this?" I nodded, though ready felt like an inadequate word for what I was about to experience. "Are they all here?" "Your mother, Linda, your brother, Jake, your sister, Amanda, and Jake's wife, Rebecca. We decided to include Rebecca because she lives in the same household as Jake and their children, which makes her part of the security equation." The same people who had sat around the Christmas tree 11 months ago, casually dismissing my life as a failure, were now in a federal facility because my success had made them targets. The symmetry was so perfect it felt scripted by someone with a sense of dramatic irony. Stevens led me through corridors that hummed with the kind of quiet efficiency that characterized all government buildings. The briefing room was exactly what I'd expected. Windowless, sterile, dominated by a conference table surrounded by chairs that looked like they'd been designed for uncomfortable conversations. And there, sitting at the far end of the table, was my family. They looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the clinical environment and the weight of circumstances they couldn't understand. Mom sat rigidly upright, her purse clutched in her lap like a shield against uncertainty. Jake looked angry and confused, the expression he wore whenever he encountered situations he couldn't control through force of personality. Amanda appeared frightened, her usual confidence replaced by the wide-eyed vulnerability she'd shown as a child. Rebecca kept glancing around the room as if searching for escape routes. The moment they saw me, their expressions shifted through a sequence of emotions that would have been comical under other circumstances. Confusion gave way to recognition, which dissolved into bewilderment as they tried to process why I was part of whatever official proceeding they'd been swept into. "Sarah?" Mom's voice carried the kind of uncertainty that suggested she was questioning her own perception. "What are you doing here? Why are you in this place?" Stevens stepped forward before I could respond, his presence commanding immediate attention from people who were clearly out of their depth. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your cooperation in coming here today. I'm Agent Stevens with the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. The reason you're here today relates to Dr. Sarah Mitchell and her current position within the United States government." The silence that followed was dense enough to cut. I watched their faces as they processed the formal way Stevens had referred to me, the implications of FBI involvement, the suggestion that my position required their presence in a secure facility. Jake's mouth actually fell open, while Amanda looked like she was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "Before we proceed, I need each of you to sign these documents," Stevens continued, distributing papers that I recognized as non-disclosure agreements. "These are legally binding commitments to maintain the confidentiality of everything you learn in this room. Violation of these agreements is a federal crime punishable by significant prison sentences." Rebecca's hands shook as she held the papers. "Prison? What kind of trouble is Sarah in?" "Mrs. Mitchell isn't in trouble," Stevens replied with the patience of someone accustomed to explaining complex situations to civilians. She's here because her work for the United States government has placed all of you in a situation that requires federal protection. I watched Jake's face as he processed the word protection, seeing his expression shift from confusion to something approaching understanding. He'd been military himself, served 2 tours in Iraq before coming home to start his construction business. He knew enough about government operations to recognize that protection meant threat, and threat meant importance. "Sarah," he said slowly, his voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard from him since we were children. "What exactly do you do for the government?" Stevens looked at me, indicating that this part of the briefing was mine to deliver. I stood up, feeling the weight of 11 months of silence about to be shattered by revelation that would change everything between us forever. "I'm the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Department of Defense," I said, the words feeling strange in the presence of people who had never heard them before. "I work at the Pentagon. I brief the Secretary of Defense, provide analysis for the President's daily intelligence briefing, and coordinate American policy response to international crises." The silence that followed lasted long enough to feel eternal. I watched each of them process information that contradicted everything they thought they knew about my life. The substitute teacher they'd pitied was actually one of the youngest senior officials in the American government. The family disgrace was actually important enough to require FBI protection. Mom spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Pentagon? You work at the Pentagon?" "Yes. I've been there for almost a year. The position requires a top-secret security clearance with special access programs. It's classified work, which is why I couldn't tell you about it." Jake leaned back in his chair, his face cycling through expressions that suggested he was rapidly recalculating everything he thought he understood about our family dynamics. "You're telling us that for the past year, while we thought you were still teaching high school, you've actually been working for the Department of Defense?" "That's correct." Amanda found her voice, though it came out smaller than usual. "But last Christmas you seemed so. You didn't have any money. You were driving that old car. You looked like you were barely getting by." "Last Christmas, I was still in graduate school. I was recruited by the Pentagon 3 weeks later, in January. Everything changed after that." Stevens stepped back into the conversation, pulling out documents that would make the abstract concrete. "Dr. Mitchell's security clearance is classified at levels that require extensive protection protocols. Her work involves access to intelligence that foreign governments would pay extraordinary amounts to obtain. This makes her a high-value target for kidnapping, blackmail, and leverage operations." He spread photographs across the table that showed our family members going about their daily routines, images that had been captured by surveillance teams they'd never noticed. "Over the past week, someone in this room has been making inquiries about Dr. Mitchell's background and current employment. These inquiries triggered automatic monitoring protocols and attracted attention from hostile intelligence services." Jake's face went white as he recognized himself in several of the photographs. "That was me. I was asking questions about Sarah because I wanted to see if she was doing better, if she'd gotten her life together." "Mr. Mitchell, your investigation inadvertently exposed your entire family to foreign surveillance operations," Stevens explained with the clinical precision of someone delivering a cancer diagnosis. "As of this morning, we have confirmed that at least 2 foreign intelligence services have identified you as potential leverage points against your sister." The weight of his words settled over the room like a toxic cloud. My family's need to verify my continued failure had made them targets of international espionage operations. Their casual dismissal of my achievements had put them in danger they couldn't have imagined existed. Rebecca spoke up, her voice tight with fear. "What does that mean for our children? Are Jake's sons in danger because of this?" "Potentially, yes," Stevens replied without softening the impact. "Which is why we're implementing comprehensive protective measures for all of you, effective immediately." I watched my family absorb the magnitude of the situation they'd been thrust into because of my importance. The same relatives who had called me a disgrace were now learning that foreign governments considered them valuable enough to target. The irony was so overwhelming it felt surreal. Mom looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between awe and confusion, and what might have been respect. "Sarah, How did this happen? How did you go from teaching high school to working at the Pentagon? For the first time in my adult life, I had their complete attention. Not their judgment, not their dismissal, not their casual cruelty, but their genuine, focused attention. They were looking at me as if they were seeing me for the first time, trying to reconcile the daughter they'd written off with the woman who commanded FBI briefings. My dissertation research caught the attention of someone at the Department of Defense, I explained, feeling strange about discussing my work in front of people who had never taken it seriously. They recruited me for a classified position that required my specific expertise in Middle Eastern policy and language skills. Jake shook his head slowly, as if trying to dislodge information that wouldn't fit into his understanding of reality. But you were so broke last year, you could barely afford gas to drive home for Christmas. Because I was a graduate student living on a teaching assistantship. Once I was hired by the government, everything changed. My salary is now more than our entire family's combined household income. The number I mentioned made Rebecca gasp audibly. Amanda's eyes widened to the point where she looked like a cartoon character processing impossible information. Mom just stared at me as if I'd revealed I was actually an alien who had been impersonating her daughter for the past year. Stevens resumed control of the briefing, explaining protection protocols that would govern their lives for the foreseeable future. Relocation assistance, security details, communication restrictions, and behavioral modifications that would help keep them safe from threats they'd never imagined facing. My family was being inducted into a world of classified operations and protective measures because I had become too important to leave unguarded. But as the briefing continued and I watched their faces process information that shattered their assumptions about my life, I realized that the vindication I'd craved was finally happening. The people who had dismissed me as a failure were learning that I was actually more successful than they'd ever imagined possible. The family disgrace was being revealed as someone so important that the federal government considered her family worth protecting. The conversation that would follow, the apologies and recriminations and attempts to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by their casual cruelty, was still ahead of us. But sitting in that briefing room, watching my family's faces as they learned the truth about what I'd become, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. I felt vindicated. Completely, overwhelmingly, undeniably vindicated. And for the first time since Christmas morning, I wasn't walking alone. The protective custody arrangements transformed my family's lives in ways that made their previous concerns about my career seem laughably trivial. Within 72 hours, Jake and Rebecca were relocated to a secure apartment complex in Northern Virginia, their sons enrolled in schools with enhanced security protocols, and their daily routines monitored by agents who blended seamlessly into suburban landscapes. Amanda was moved from her university housing to a government-provided residence near Georgetown. Her master's program now coordinated through channels that ensured her safety without disrupting her education. Mom was the most disoriented by the sudden upheaval, finding herself in a retirement community that looked normal but operated under security measures she couldn't fully comprehend. The financial aspects of their protection were handled with the same efficiency that characterized all government operations. Jake's construction business was temporarily managed by associates while he adjusted to life under federal protection. Amanda's tuition and living expenses were covered by programs designed to support families of high-value personnel. Mom's housing and healthcare were upgraded to levels she'd never experienced, all paid for by budgets that existed, because I had become important enough to justify them. But the emotional reconstruction was far more complex than the logistical arrangements. The first family dinner under protection took place in a secure facility that looked like an upscale conference center, but hummed with the kind of electronic countermeasures that prevented foreign intelligence services from monitoring our conversations. Sitting around a table where every word was protected by classification levels that would have seemed impossible a week earlier, we attempted to navigate relationships that had been fundamentally altered by revelation. Mom spent most of that first dinner staring at me as if she was trying to reconcile two completely different people who happened to share the same face. "Sarah, I keep thinking about last Christmas," she said, her voice carrying a tone I'd never heard from her before. "The things we said to you, the way we treated you. We had no idea." "You had no idea because I couldn't tell you," I replied, though the words felt inadequate to bridge the gap between their assumptions and my reality. Everything about my work is classified. I couldn't share any of it. Jake pushed food around his plate without eating, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked like shame. I've been thinking about that morning, about calling you the family disgrace. Jesus, Sarah, I can't believe we said that to someone who was about to be recruited by the Pentagon. The apology hung in the air between us, weighted with 11 months of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. Part of me wanted to accept it graciously, to pretend that their words hadn't carved wounds that still ached. But another part of me, the part that had walked alone through federal buildings while they assumed I was failing, wasn't ready to grant absolution that easily. You said those things because you believed them, I said quietly. My position doesn't change the fact that you thought I was worthless enough to deserve that kind of treatment. Amanda shifted uncomfortably, picking at her napkin with nervous fingers. We were worried about you. You seemed so lost, so directionless. We thought you were wasting your life. I was building my life, I corrected. I was developing expertise that would make me valuable to the most powerful government in the world. You saw failure because you couldn't imagine success that looked different from your own. The conversation continued through courses that no one seemed to taste, each exchange revealing layers of misunderstanding that had accumulated over years. My family had constructed a narrative about my life that made them comfortable with their dismissal of my choices, and discovering that narrative was wrong forced them to confront their own capacity for cruelty towards someone they claimed to love. But the real revelation came when Stevens joined us for coffee, carrying documents that would explain why Jake's amateur investigation had triggered such extensive security responses. Mr. Mitchell, your inquiries about your sister's background attracted attention because they followed patterns that foreign intelligence services use when they're developing targeting profiles. Jake's face went pale. Targeting profiles? When hostile governments want to compromise someone in Dr. Mitchell's position, they start by gathering information about family members who might be used as leverage points. Your questions about her employment, her finances, her educational background, her departure from previous positions, these are exactly the kind of inquiries that would precede a kidnapping or blackmail operation. The weight of his words settled over Jake like a physical burden. His attempt to verify my continued failure had inadvertently made him look like a foreign operative developing intelligence on a high-value target. The irony was so perfect it felt like justice, delivered by cosmic forces with a sense of humor. I was just trying to understand what happened to her, Jake said, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. After Christmas, after the things we said, I wanted to see if she was doing better. I thought maybe I could reach out, try to fix things between us. Your timing couldn't have been worse, Stevens replied with the clinical precision that characterized all his communications. Dr. Mitchell's promotion to Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary happened just weeks before you started making inquiries. The coincidence made your investigation look like intelligence gathering related to her new position. The room went quiet as my family processed the magnitude of the misunderstanding that had transformed them from critics into protected persons. Jake's concern for my well-being had been interpreted as potential espionage activity because I had become too important for any interest in my life to be considered innocent. Over the following weeks, as we adjusted to life under protection protocols, the dynamic between us shifted in ways that felt both healing and surreal. My family began treating me with a deference that would have been flattering if it hadn't felt so foreign. Mom started asking about my work in careful, respectful tones that suggested she was interviewing someone she'd read about in newspapers. Jake stopped offering unsolicited advice about my life choices and began asking questions that indicated genuine curiosity about my expertise. Amanda seemed almost intimidated by me, as if she was afraid that casual conversation might inadvertently reveal classified information. The financial revelation was particularly transformative. When they learned that my salary exceeded their combined household incomes, the lectures about financial responsibility and career planning simply evaporated. The daughter they'd pitied for her inability to support herself was now wealthier than all of them combined, with benefits packages that included housing allowances larger than their mortgage payments. But the professional recognition was what truly shifted their perception of my worth. When Secretary Williams visited the secure facility to brief my family on ongoing threats, His obvious respect for my work made it impossible for them to maintain their previous assessment of my achievements. Watching a cabinet-level official defer to my expertise on international policy, seeing him describe my analysis as critical to national security, forced them to confront the magnitude of their misunderstanding. Dr. Mitchell's work has prevented conflicts that could have destabilized entire regions, Secretary Williams explained to my family, with the gravity of someone who understood the weight of such statements. Her analysis has influenced policy decisions that affect millions of people. She's one of our most valuable assets in Middle Eastern affairs. Mom asked the question that had been building since the briefings began. How valuable? Secretary Williams paused, choosing his words carefully. Mrs. Mitchell, your daughter's knowledge and expertise make her a target for every major intelligence service in the world. Her protection isn't just about her personal safety. It's about protecting information that could affect global stability if it fell into the wrong hands. The pride in Mom's voice when she responded was something I'd waited my entire life to hear. We had no idea what she was capable of. The medal ceremony took place in January, exactly 1 year after that devastating Christmas morning. The timing felt deliberately symbolic, as if the universe was providing a precise anniversary measurement of how dramatically everything had changed. The Secretary of Defense Medal for Exceptional Public Service was presented in a ceremony attended by senior officials whose names appeared regularly in international news, but the moment that mattered most was seeing my family in the audience. They sat in the front row, dressed in formal attire that had been provided by security teams who understood the importance of appearances at such events. Mom wiped away tears during the citation reading that described my contributions to regional stability and conflict prevention. Jake looked stunned throughout the entire ceremony, as if he still couldn't process that the sister he'd called a disgrace was receiving recognition from the Secretary of Defense. Amanda recorded everything on a phone that had been cleared by security, determined to document proof of achievements she'd never imagined possible. The reception afterward was the first time my professional and personal worlds had ever intersected. Watching my family navigate conversations with generals and policy advisors, seeing them struggle to reconcile their daughter and sister with the person everyone else treated as an expert, provided a kind of closure I hadn't known I needed. Colonel Hayes, who had recruited me from my cramped apartment less than a year earlier, approached my mother during the reception with an observation that felt like vindication distilled into words. Mrs. Mitchell, you should know that your daughter's work has been extraordinary. Her insights have influenced policy at the highest levels of government. You raised someone truly exceptional. The transformation in my family's behavior was complete but complicated. Their newfound respect was genuine but felt performative, as if they were overcompensating for their previous dismissal by treating me like a celebrity they'd happened to be related to. The casual cruelty had been replaced by careful deference, but neither extreme felt like the authentic family relationship I'd always wanted. The conversation that finally addressed the core of our dysfunction came during a private dinner at a secure location in February. Away from FBI agents and security protocols, we attempted to have the kind of honest discussion that our family had never managed before the classification levels forced it upon us. I need you to understand something, I said, looking around the table at faces that had learned to take me seriously. The success I've achieved doesn't erase what happened last Christmas. The position I hold doesn't change the fact that when I needed your support, you chose cruelty instead. Jake nodded slowly, his hands folded in front of him like a child preparing for punishment. I know, we were wrong about everything, but Sarah, how could we have known? You never gave us any indication that you were capable of this level of achievement. I gave you 6 years of graduate school, fluency in multiple languages, and research that universities considered groundbreaking, I replied, feeling the old frustration resurface despite everything that had changed. You chose not to see potential in any of it, because it didn't match your definition of success. Mom reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly as she touched mine. We were afraid for you. You seemed so alone, so disconnected from normal life. We thought you were hiding from responsibility. I was preparing for responsibility you couldn't imagine, I said, though my voice was gentler now. The life you thought was normal would never have led to work that mattered this much. Amanda spoke up for the first time in the conversation, her voice carrying a maturity I hadn't heard from her before. Sarah, I think we were jealous. Not of your situation, because we thought it was terrible, but of your confidence. You never seemed to doubt that what you were doing was important, even when everyone around you was telling you it wasn't. The insight surprised me with its accuracy. I had been confident, desperately so, clinging to belief in my own potential when external validation was non-existent. That confidence had carried me through years of criticism and doubt, but it had also made me seem arrogant to people who couldn't see what I was working toward. The hardest part, I admitted, wasn't your doubt in my abilities. It was your certainty that I deserved to fail. You didn't just think I was making mistakes. You thought I was fundamentally flawed as a person. The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. They couldn't deny the accuracy of my assessment, because the evidence was too clear. The memory of their Christmas morning cruelty too recent and vivid. Rebecca, who had been mostly quiet throughout our family reconstruction, offered an observation that cut to the heart of everything. I think we made Sarah into a scapegoat for our own fears about taking risks. Her willingness to pursue something uncertain made all of our safe choices look cowardly by comparison. The truth of her words settled over us like revelation. My family had punished me for having the courage to pursue dreams that might fail, because my courage highlighted their own decisions to avoid similar risks. The family disgrace had become a mirror that reflected their own limitations back at them. But understanding the psychology of their cruelty didn't erase its impact. The wounds they'd inflicted with their casual dismissal couldn't be healed by revelations about my importance. Professional vindication had restored my confidence, but it couldn't repair the damage to relationships that had been poisoned by their assumption that I was worthless. The final conversation happened in April, as spring transformed Washington into something that looked like hope made manifest. My family was preparing to return to modified versions of their normal lives, their protection details scaled back, as the immediate threats receded. The crisis that had forced our reunion was resolving, but the changes it had brought to our relationships would be permanent. "I want you to know that I forgive you," I told them during our last dinner under federal protection. "Not because you've earned it, but because carrying anger toward people who can't understand their own cruelty is exhausting." Mom cried openly, tears streaming down her face as she processed absolution she hadn't thought to ask for. "We don't deserve your forgiveness. We failed you completely." "You failed to recognize my potential," I corrected, "but you also gave me the motivation to prove you wrong." Sometimes the greatest gifts come from the people who doubt us most completely. Jake looked confused by my generosity. "How can you be so understanding after what we put you through?" "Because success is the best revenge," I replied, smiling for the first time in months. "And I succeeded beyond anything you could have imagined possible." The Pentagon ceremony announcing my appointment to the National Security Council took place in May, exactly 18 months after that Christmas morning when they'd called me a disgrace. The position would make me one of the youngest advisors in presidential history, with direct access to Oval Office briefings and responsibility for shaping American foreign policy for decades to come. My family attended the announcement, sitting in an audience filled with reporters and officials who understood the significance of my appointment. This time, there were no tears or shock, just quiet pride in achievements they'd learned to recognize as extraordinary. The daughter they'd written off was becoming one of the most powerful policy voices in American government. But the moment that provided the deepest satisfaction came afterward, during the reception when a reporter approached my mother for a comment about my appointment. "Mrs. Mitchell, you must be incredibly proud of your daughter's achievements. Did you always know she was capable of reaching these heights?" Mom looked at me across the room, her expression carrying the weight of everything we'd been through together. "I'm learning that there's a lot about my daughter I never understood. She's extraordinary in ways I'm still discovering." The honesty of her answer felt like the closest thing to genuine reconciliation we'd achieved. She wasn't claiming credit for my success or pretending she'd always believed in my potential. She was acknowledging that her understanding of my worth had been fundamentally wrong and was still evolving. 6 months later, as I prepared for my first presidential briefing, I received a package from home that contained something I'd never expected to see. Inside was a framed photograph from my Pentagon medal ceremony, with a note in my mother's handwriting that simply said, "We're sorry we didn't see who you really were. We're proud of who you've become." The apology was smaller than the hurt it addressed, but it represented something more valuable than the recognition itself. It was acknowledgement that their assessment of my worth had been catastrophically wrong, that the family disgrace had been anything but disgraceful. Standing in the White House, preparing to brief the president on international crisis management, I thought about that Christmas morning that had started this entire journey. The daughter who had walked alone from that living room was now walking into the Oval Office. The family disgrace was now someone whose opinions shaped global policy. The transformation was complete, the vindication absolute. But more importantly, I had learned something about the nature of worth that my family's cruelty had inadvertently taught me. Value isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. It's inherent, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to pursue their own potential, regardless of external validation. I'd started this journey believing I needed their approval to be valuable. I'd ended it understanding that my value had never depended on their recognition. The Pentagon hadn't called their assessment of me, they'd called mine. And that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.